James Dean challenged Sammy Davis Jr. to a motorcycle race, and the bet they made shocked everyone who heard it. It was a warm Saturday afternoon in July 1955, and Sammy Davis Jr. was taking a rare break from his hectic performance schedule. He'd been working non-stop for months, bouncing between nightclub engagements, recording sessions, and television appearances, and his manager had finally convinced him to take a weekend off at a friend's ranch in Malibu. The ranch belonged to Tony Curtis, who had invited a small group of Hollywood friends for what he called a decompression weekend. No cameras, no agents, no scripts, just a chance for entertainers to relax and be themselves, away from the spotlight. Sammy had arrived that morning on his prized Harley-Davidson, a sleek black and chrome machine that he'd customized himself. Motorcycles had become his passion outside of entertainment, a way to feel free and escape the constant pressure of being on all the time. There was something about the open road and the roar of the engine that reminded him he was more than just a performer. He was a person with his own interests and adventures. When he pulled up to the ranch, revving his engine as he came to a stop, he noticed another motorcycle parked near the main house. It was a Triumph Thunderbird, British-made and obviously well-maintained, with a few modifications that showed its owner knew something about bikes. "Nice ride," came a voice from behind him. Sammy turned to see James Dean walking toward him, cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth, wearing jeans and a white t-shirt that had become his signature look. Dean was Hollywood's newest sensation, the brooding actor whose performance in East of Eden had made him an instant star, and the unofficial spokesman for a generation of young Americans who felt misunderstood by their parents. "Thanks," Sammy replied, pulling off his helmet. "That your Triumph over there?" "Guilty as charged," Dean said with a slight smile. "I've been riding since I was 16. Started on a little 125cc bike back in Indiana. Worked my way up to this beauty." The two men had met briefly at a few Hollywood parties, but they'd never really had a chance to talk. They came from completely different worlds. Sammy from the world of vaudeville and nightclubs, Dean from method acting and the emerging youth culture that was beginning to define the 1950s. But standing there next to their motorcycles, they found an immediate common ground. "What kind of modifications you got on that Harley?" Dean asked, walking over to examine Sammy's bike more closely. "Upgraded the exhaust system, tweaked the carburetor for better performance, and had the seat custom-made for longer rides," Sammy explained. "She'll do about 120 on a straightaway if you give her enough room." Dean whistled appreciatively. "Sweet setup. I've been thinking about doing some work on the Triumph, but I've been too busy with the new picture." They spent the next 20 minutes talking about engines, gear ratios, and the best routes for riding in the hills around Los Angeles. Despite their different backgrounds, they discovered a shared love for speed, mechanical precision, and the particular kind of freedom that came from being on two wheels with nothing but the road ahead. "You know," Dean said eventually, "I heard you're pretty competitive when it comes to, well, everything." Sammy laughed. "Where'd you hear that?" "Tony Curtis mentioned you once beat Frank Sinatra at pool, took Dean Martin's money at poker, and outdanced Gene Kelly at some party. Guy said you don't like to lose at anything." "I don't like to lose," Sammy admitted, "but I also don't start fights I can't finish." Dean's eyes lit up with the kind of mischievous expression that had made him famous. "What if I told you I've never lost a motorcycle race? I'd say you probably haven't raced the right people yet. Is that a challenge, Mr. Davis?" Sammy looked at Dean, then at the two motorcycles, then at the long, straight stretch of private road that led from the ranch house down to the main highway about 2 miles away. It was perfect racing territory, smooth asphalt, no traffic, and enough room to really open up the engines. "Depends on what you're willing to bet," Sammy said. Dean took a long drag from his cigarette and flicked it away. "What did you have in mind?" "How about this?" Sammy said, his competitive instincts kicking in. Loser has to do something that's completely outside their comfort zone, something that challenges everything people think they know about them. Dean raised an eyebrow. Such as? If I lose, Sammy continued, I'll take acting lessons, real method acting, like what you do. Spend a month studying with Lee Strasberg or whoever you think could teach me something. And if I lose, Sammy grinned, you have to come to the Copa and do a musical number. On stage, in front of a paying audience. Sing, dance, the whole entertainment package. The suggestion hit Dean like a physical blow. The idea of James Dean, the tough, rebellious, too-cool-for-school actor, getting up on stage at one of New York's most famous nightclubs and performing like a song and dance man was almost absurd. You're kidding, Dean said. Dead serious. That's the bet. Each of us has to step completely out of our established persona and try something we've never done before. Something that would shock people who think they know us. Dean was quiet for a long moment, considering the proposal. Sammy could see him weighing the risks and rewards, trying to figure out whether his confidence in his motorcycle skills was worth the potential embarrassment of having to perform musical theater. What song? Dean asked finally. Your choice, but it has to be a real number. Singing, dancing, maybe some patter, full entertainment value. And you'd really take acting lessons if you lose? Method acting, Sammy confirmed. Learn to access real emotions, study character motivation, the whole serious actor approach. Even though everyone knows me as an entertainer. Dean walked over to his Triumph and ran his hand along the fuel tank, thinking. You know, he said, this is either the dumbest bet I've ever made or the most interesting thing that's happened to me all year. So you're in? Dean looked up at Sammy with that slightly defiant expression that had made him a star. I'm in, but we're going to need witnesses, and we're going to need some ground rules. As if summoned by the mention of witnesses, Tony Curtis emerged from the ranch house, followed by several other guests who had been drawn outside by the sound of motorcycle engines and animated conversation. What's all the commotion out here? Curtis asked. James and I are about to settle a question about motorcycle superiority, Sammy explained, and we need some people to make sure the winner collects on the bet. When they explained the terms of the wager, the small group of Hollywood personalities gathered around them erupted in laughter and amazement. The idea of James Dean singing and dancing at the Copa was hilarious enough, but the thought of Sammy Davis Jr. studying method acting was equally entertaining. This I have to see, said Janet Lee, who had been sunbathing by the pool. Either outcome is going to be worth the price of admission. What are the race rules? Asked Curtis, who had appointed himself as the official referee. Simple, Dean said. Straight run from here to the highway and back. First one back to this spot wins. No cutting corners, no dirty tricks, just speed and skill. And no backing out once you start, Sammy added. They spent the next few minutes checking their bikes, adjusting mirrors, and making sure they had enough fuel for the race. Dean's Triumph was lighter and more agile, but Sammy's Harley had more raw power. On paper, it seemed like an even match. You sure about this? Dean asked as they lined up their motorcycles at the starting line Curtis had marked with a couple of pool chairs. Having second thoughts about performing at the Copa? Sammy replied. Not a chance. Just wanted to make sure you're ready to learn how to really act. Curtis raised his hand to start the race. Gentlemen, start your engines. Both motorcycles roared to life, the sound echoing off the hills surrounding the ranch. On your mark. Sammy and Dean revved their engines, looking straight ahead at the road that would determine who would step outside their comfort zone. Get set. The anticipation was almost unbearable. The small group of witnesses held their breath. Both riders shot forward like bullets, their motorcycles accelerating rapidly down the straight stretch of road. For the first few hundred yards, they rode side by side, neither gaining a significant advantage. Dean's Triumph was quicker off the line, but Sammy's Harley was gaining power as they picked up speed. At the halfway point to the highway, Sammy had pulled slightly ahead. His experience with motorcycles and his natural competitive instincts were serving him well. But Dean wasn't finished. As they approached the turnaround point, he found a burst of speed that pulled him even with Sammy again. They reached the highway marker at almost exactly the same time, both riders executing tight turns that demonstrated real skill and experience. But it was on the return trip that the real race began. Dean's lighter bike gave him an advantage on acceleration out of the turn, and he managed to pull ahead by about a bike length as they headed back toward the ranch. But Sammy wasn't about to give up. He opened up the Harley's throttle completely, using every bit of power the modified engine could provide. The witnesses back at the ranch could hear the motorcycles long before they could see them. Two engines pushed to their limits, creating a symphony of speed and competition that grew louder as the riders approached. As they came into view for the final stretch, it was impossible to tell who was winning. The two motorcycles were neck and neck, both riders leaning forward into the wind, neither giving an inch. With about 100 yards to go, something unexpected happened. Instead of continuing to fight for position, both riders began to slow down slightly, as if they had simultaneously realized something important. They crossed the finish line together, their front wheels so close that it was impossible for the witnesses to determine a winner. "Dead heat," Curtis called out. "I'm calling it a tie." As the motorcycles came to a stop and the engines fell silent, both riders sat for a moment, breathing heavily from the adrenaline and exertion of the race. "Hell of a ride," Dean said, pulling off his helmet. "You're not bad yourself," Sammy replied. "So what happens with the bet?" asked Janet Lee. "Do you both have to do your challenges?" Sammy and Dean looked at each other for a long moment. Then both started laughing. "You know what?" Sammy said. "I think we both learned something about each other today. Maybe the real bet was finding out we have more in common than we thought." "Agreed," Dean said. "But I'll tell you what. If you ever want to take some acting lessons, I know some people. And if I ever get the nerve to try performing, I'll give you a call." "Deal," Sammy said, extending his hand. They shook hands, and the gathered witnesses applauded what had turned into something much more interesting than a simple motorcycle race. Over the next few months, Sammy and Dean developed an unlikely friendship. They would occasionally meet up for rides through the hills, talking about their careers, their dreams, and their shared sense that they were both trying to break out of the boxes that Hollywood had created for them. Dean never did perform at the Copa, but he did attend one of Sammy's shows there, sitting in the back and watching with obvious fascination as Sammy commanded the stage with his singing, dancing, and comedy. Sammy never took formal method acting lessons, but he did start incorporating some of Dean's approaches to finding emotional truth in his performances, particularly when he began taking on more serious acting roles later in his career. When James Dean died in a car crash just a few months later, Sammy was devastated. He attended the funeral and spoke about their brief but meaningful friendship. "Jimmy taught me that talent isn't about staying in your lane," Sammy said. "It's about being willing to challenge yourself, to race against your own limitations." That afternoon at Tony's ranch, we didn't just race motorcycles. We raced toward understanding each other, toward becoming better artists and better people. The motorcycle race that ended in a tie became a Hollywood legend. But for Sammy, it was more than just a good story. It was a reminder that the most important competitions aren't about winning or losing. They're about discovering what you're capable of when you're willing to take risks and step outside your comfort zone. Years later, Sammy would often tell young performers about that day, using it as an example of how genuine connection and mutual respect could develop between people who seemed to have nothing in common. Sometimes, he would say, the best way to understand someone is to race them, not to beat them, but to see what they're made of when everything is on the line. If this incredible story of an unlikely friendship, a legendary motorcycle race, and the bet that brought two Hollywood icons together moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this with anyone who's ever formed an unexpected friendship through shared interests. or anyone who needs to remember that competition can bring out the best in people when it's based on mutual respect. Have you ever bonded with someone through a shared challenge or competition? Let us know in the comments about the times when rivalry turned into friendship. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing true stories about the connections that can develop when we step outside our comfort zones.